Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I don't even know if that sounds any different. In my head, it sounded cool. So, anyhow, today we are jumping into Psalms 33 through 35. And if you have been riding with me, if you've been watching these videos, and even if you haven't, just pretend that you have. If you've been riding with me here, we've been kind of on this emotional roller coaster with my man David. One minute he's trusting God, the next minute he's spiraling, then he's back to trusting God and praising, and then he's asking God to smite people, which it's not, if I'm real, not usually part of my morning prayer routine. But hey, honesty counts, and David has shown us that, bringing our honest emotions before God. And honestly, I kind of love that about David in the book of Psalms, because if we're real, that's kind of what faith feels like a lot of times. It's not this steady incline of spiritual maturity where you're just crushing it every day. It's more like, God, I trust you. Wait, why is everything around me falling apart? Okay, I trust you again. But also, can you smite people? But Psalm 33, 34, and 35 capture these three sort of movements here. God is powerful and trustworthy. Two, life can be messy and unjust at times. And then sometimes when you're just like, God, are you seeing this? Are you here right now? If you've ever felt any of those things, then welcome aboard. You are in the right place. Let's go. All right, so Psalm 33 is basically showing us that God is in control even when it doesn't feel like it. And Psalm 33 is interesting specifically because it's one of the few chapters in this section that doesn't have a named author. There's no of David above the text, there's no backstory headline above the text. And honestly, that kind of fits the message perfectly because it's not about one person's situation, it's about the whole world under God's rule. So when it opens up with these instruments, lyres, harps, loud praise, it's not trying to be performative, it's trying to wake people up. Not sing if you feel like it, but sing because of what is true. Verse 4 says, "For the word of the Lord holds true, and we can trust everything he does." And those words holds true, it carries the idea of being upright, straight, dependable. In a world where everything bends, opinions, leaders, systems, God doesn't bend. Then in verse 6 it says, "The Lord merely spoke, and the heavens were created. He breathed the word, and all the stars were born." So this is a callback to Genesis chapter 1. God creates the entire world, the entire universe, not by effort, but by authority. No tools, no process, just spoken word from God, which means the same voice that said, "Let there be light, let there be stars, let there be humans and animals and plants," is the same exact voice that you're being asked to trust. And that's sort of the logic of the book of Psalms. If his word can create galaxies, it can certainly handle your situation, even if your situation feels small by comparison. But then it zooms in onto geopolitics. It says in verse 10, "The Lord frustrates the plans of the nations and thwarts all of their schemes." So think empires, armies, rulers. They're all making moves that they think are permanent. History says this will last forever. But God says, we'll see about that. And you see this kind of play out all over the Old Testament, especially in books like Daniel, where kings rise and fall overnight. So Psalm 33 is basically saying God is not reacting to the world events that are happening. World events are happening inside of his sovereignty. Then comes this war horse line in verse 17. It says, "Don't count on your war horse to give you victory, for all its strength it cannot save you." So when I think of a war horse, and maybe even specifically a war horse who's pulling a chariot, I think of ancient military tech, speed, power, intimidation. Probably the closest thing that these folks had to a tank. So translate that to be in more modern terms, and it says something like, don't put your ultimate trust in the most impressive advantage that you think you have, because the issue isn't whether or not those things work, it's whether or not they can save. And then the psalm ends not with answers, but with posture. In verse 20, it says, "We put our hope in the Lord. He is our help and our shield." Not because everything makes sense, but because he does. And then Psalm 34 shows us that God is near, especially in times of mess, and especially in times of chaos. God is near. Now, this chapter has a very specific backstory, and it's kind of crazy. The heading in my Bible says, "A Psalm of David regarding the time he pretended to be insane in front of Abimelech, who sent him away." So this heading connects back to a story back in 1 Samuel chapter 21 when David is fleeing Saul and he ends up in Philistine territory. Now, specifically, Gath. Now, for those of you that don't know, that is enemy ground. But not just any enemy. This is the hometown of that fella Goliath. You remember Goliath, the giant that David had slayed. So picture this. David walks into the city where the guy he killed used to live. He's carrying Goliath's sword and he's hoping that no one notices. Spoiler alert, they notice. So servants of Achish recognize him. They start quoting that song. Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And the translation for that is essentially, hey, isn't that the guy who's famous for killing us? So then David, he panics. He pretends to be insane. He scratches at doors. He's drooling. He's acting completely unhinged. And it kind of works. Achish basically says, I have enough crazy people to deal with already, and he kicks David out. And that's the moment that Psalm 34 comes from. So when David says in verse 4, I prayed to the Lord and he answered me, he freed me from all of my fears. He's not saying God made everything smooth for me. He's saying God met me in a moment where I was terrified and I was improvising survival tactics. And that's why the focus is on fear, not circumstance. Then in verse 8, it says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, the joys of those who take refuge in him. Now, this isn't theoretical theology. This is field-tested, battle-tested stuff. David is basically saying, I just came out of a situation where I had no control, and somehow I'm still here. I'm still alive. Try trusting him, try trusting in God, and see what happens. Then verse 18 says, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. Now, David writes that as someone who had lost his status, lost his safety. He's living in caves shortly after these events in 1 Samuel chapter 22. This isn't poetic exaggeration from David. This is biography. This is actual events that happened to him. And then in verse 19 it says, the righteous person faces many troubles, but the Lord comes to rescue each time. So that line corrects a common assumption that if you're righteous, you will be problem-free. You'll be carefree. We all know that that's not true. In fact, David is saying exactly the opposite. Following God doesn't remove the trouble from our lives. It redefines who rescues you in it. Then we move into Psalm 35. And Psalm 35 feels intense because, well, it is intense. But again, it's grounded in real relationships, not random anger. David is still being hunted by Saul. He's still being betrayed by the people around him. So when he says in verse 1, O Lord, oppose those who oppose me, fight those who fight against me. So that's legal language, like a courtroom. God, take my case, be my defense. Then the blow them away like chaff in the wind line in verse 5, that imagery comes from threshing grain. Farmers would toss crushed grain into the air, and the useless stuff, the useless husks, the chaff, would blow away in the wind because it was light. So David is not just venting here, he's asking God to expose what's empty and remove it. Then verse 14 adds some depth here. It says, I was sad as though they were my friends or family, as if I were grieving for my own mother. Now this is betrayal, not just opposition. These people he cared about, prayed for, showed up for, now they're turning on him. And that's a different kind of pain than enemies who are attacking you. That's a different kind of pain than enemies who you expect to treat you a certain way. Then we get the raw question in verse 17 where it says, how long, O Lord, will you look on and do nothing? Rescue me from their fierce attacks. Protect my life from these lions. Now you see that phrase, how long, O Lord? It shows up all over the book of Psalms. It's not disbelief, but it's strained trust. Like, I still believe that you see this, but I don't understand why you haven't acted yet. And here's the key. David brings that tension to God, not away from him. He doesn't numb it. He doesn't try to suppress it. He doesn't go and take revenge himself without talking it through with God. He hands it over to God, which is why he can still say in verse 9, then I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be glad because he rescues me. Not because his situation just changed, but because he chose where to place his situation and in whose hands to place his situation. I probably said that wrong, but whatever. So when you zoom out, all three of these Psalms point straight to Jesus in a powerful way. Psalm 33 shows us a God who's sovereign, who's in control. Psalm 34 shows us a God who is near to the brokenhearted. And then finally, Psalm 35 shows us a God who sees injustice and will make all things right. And in Jesus, all three of these things collide. Jesus is the Word through whom all things were made. We see that in John chapter 1. Jesus is also the one who drew near to the brokenhearted. He touched lepers. He ate with sinners. He wept with people that were in pain. And then in Psalm 35, where David cries out for justice, we see Jesus take a surprising turn. Instead of calling down judgment on his enemy, Jesus absorbs it for his enemies. He becomes the innocent one who is falsely accused, who is betrayed, who is mocked, and instead of saying, "Destroy them," he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So the justice that David longs for is very real, but in the gospel we see that justice and mercy meet at the cross. So, what do we actually do with this? Well, number one, I think we need to re anchor our trust in God daily. Psalm 33 reminds us that God is in control, even when our lives feel like it's held together by duct tape and good intentions. We have to start our day reminding ourselves God's plans are steady, even if my plans aren't. The second thing I think we need to do is bring our real emotions to God. Psalm 34 and 35 give us permission to be honest, not polished, not filtered. If you're angry, if you're confused, if you're hurt, say it. Bring that to God. God already knows. You're not informing Him, you're inviting Him to be a part of that with you. And last but not least, I think we need to choose trust before we feel it. Taste and see implies action. Sometimes you don't feel like trusting God, but step into it anyways, and over time, your experience will catch up to your obedience. And here's the challenging thought in that. Are you waiting for your circumstances to change before you trust God, or are you willing to trust Him in the middle of those circumstances? So, let me end by saying this. These three chapters remind us that God is powerful, present, and just, and He doesn't always move on our timeline, which can feel inconvenient at times, but it's also probably for the best, because if God operated on my timeline, I would have made some terrible decisions, some terrible calls. So maybe the invitation today is not to have everything figured out, it's to trust the one who already does. Take some time, read through these Psalms again, slowly, and maybe, just maybe, be a little bit more honest with God than you usually are. Believe me, He can handle it. Won't He do it?